Messmer the Impaler.
My clan's suffering, their pain, all that they felt.
A bloodthirsty tyrant and a demigod with a secret curse that dwelt deep within him.
I can only assume he fights for his own reasons and carries his own burdens.
He was known as a man who embarked on a genocidal campaign to purge all those who lacked grace within the land of shadow.
Those stripped of the grace of gold shall all meet death.
His purge of the land was a savage and torturous one, wielding a deadly flame and impaling his victims high up in the air for all to see, earning him his namesake, Messmer the Impaler. It would seem that he desired nothing more than to burn and eradicate all those within reach of his flame, which he also seemed to do with an intense satisfaction, and it could also be argued that because of this, he has quite literally branded his mark in the history books of Elden Ring and on the lands between itself. There are no records or paintings of Messmer that have been left behind. There are no ancient or wise beings to speak his name despite his demigod status. In the lands between, all those who are deemed as demigods and those who are seen as their equals have clear traces of the marks that they have left on the world. Even Godric the Grafted, a man who is mocked and referred to as the runt of the litter, has many people who remember his deeds and still speak his name. And so why has Messmer, this evil overlord who was not only responsible for one of the most tragic events of his time, but also the son of one of Elden Ring's most influential beings, completely erased from the history and the lands itself? In a time long before the Shattering, Messmer was born the son of Queen Marika the Eternal, and it is believed that his father was none other than Radagon of the Golden Order. There are many signs that point towards Marika being the mother of Messmer, as he refers to her as his mother, and as for his father, the dominant red hair that is seen not only on Radagon, but also his offspring, helps suggest that he was their child, and as a result of this, it would also mean that he is a sibling towards both Malenia and Miquella, as well as having a younger sister who at this point is believed to be none other than Melina, the very same that the player Tarnished encounters during their journey, and the reason for this being that Messmer's kindling points towards a younger sister, which is stated as saying, Messmer, much like his younger sister, bore a vision of fire, which is most likely a reference to Melina herself. Much like his siblings who would all bear the burden of a terrible curse, Messmer too was born an accursed child, for deep down within him, a dark serpent resided, a serpent which he referred to as the Abyssal Serpent, which would constantly eat away at the flame within him. One theory would suggest that the existence of this corrupting serpent was most likely the actions of an outer god, interfering with Messmer in some shape or form. Perhaps he had caught the attention of a dark and sinister god that resides within the dark and vast abyss of space, and was cursed with this as a result. However, the true nature for the serpent's cause is not made clear. Regardless of this, the very existence and dark nature of this serpent was enough to cause his mother Marika to take drastic action, most likely due to the threat that the serpent and the flame within posed to the Erd Tree. She attempted to contain its corrupting influence, which she did so by removing one of Messmer's eyes and replacing it with what is later referred to as the Seal of Grace. This would not only mean that Messmer was born without grace and had to be gifted it by his mother, but it would also prevent the winged serpents that dwelled within him to fully take form. He was forced to live a life of harmony with the serpent that would constantly eat away at his flame, where time and time again he would hope to rid himself of it, but to no avail. Despite this, he continued to live his life as best as he could, befriending many people of great influence and status during his time, such as Commander Gaius, a soldier who was one of the leaders during Messmer's crusade to purge the Land of Shadow. Like Messmer, Gaius also lacked grace from birth as he was born an Albinauric, and this could be one of the deciding factors which the two would have most likely bonded over and formed a friendship on. Both Messmer and Gaius acted as elder brothers to the infamous General Radahn, indicating that Messmer himself was much older than his stepbrother sibling, but also informing us that even if only for a short period, there was once a point in time where all the demigod offspring were interacting with each other, or at the very least, they were aware of each other's existence, long before Messmer's removal from its entirety. There were many others who also grew close to Messmer and followed him with little regard or thought for anything or anyone else. Another prominent figure being R'Lana, the younger sister of R'nala, who eventually came to be known as the Sword of Messmer during his campaign and hailed from the House of Caria. She was a Twin Moon Knight who abandoned her royal duties and birthright to stand with him when called upon. Alongside this, Black Knight Andreas, the leader of Messmer's primary force during the Purge, and his son, Black Knight Captain Hugh, were also devout followers and friends of Messmer. However, unlike R'Lana and Gaius, they would one day face a far more cruel and unfortunate fate. It would seem that Messmer was able to inspire and befriend people from all aspects of life. Albinaurics, Parian royals, and devout followers of the Golden Order all flocked to his cause despite their different backgrounds. He even had favor with other demigods who looked up to him, which in turn could imply that maybe Messmer the Impaler was not the horrible and cruel tyrant that he is initially made out to be upon entering the Land of Shadow. One day, Queen Marika ordered Messmer to embark on a journey that was initially sold to him as an ambitious and righteous crusade. A crusade to purge the Land of Shadow of those who lacked grace and were deemed as enemies of the Golden Order. Without question or hesitation, Messmer gathered an army which would allow him to carry out the wishes of his mother, an army which consisted of those who were loyal and close to him and who would lay waste to Marika's enemies in the name of the Golden Order. This army began to decimate the Land of Shadow, brutally murdering and torturing anyone and anything that could be deemed as heresy to the Golden Order. However, whilst doing so, it is believed that Messmer himself did not know the real reason for the purge which Marika had ordered. In his mind, he was simply following his mother's wishes, as he was nothing more than a loyal and devoted man who wanted to please his mother dearly. Alongside this, it would seem that during the crusade, some theories suggest that Messmer's own soldiers encouraged him to preserve some of the ancient tomes and texts of the people that they were persecuting. Located within the Shadow Keep, there resides a storeroom which contains a massive library spanning several floors, where many shadow beings can be seen reading its contents. Even Knight Leda and Sir Ansbach can be encountered within the rooms, with their own purpose of gaining knowledge and information, as there is no better place to do so. Once again, this serves as an indication to Messmer's deeper and more complex emotions. He did not wish to completely erase those that he had purged from history. Perhaps to do so would be a fate so cruel that not even his enemies deserved it. He was someone who heeded the words of those around him, someone who would listen to the needs and wants of others, demonstrating his considerate and compassionate side in the process. The murderous crusade carried on for a significant amount of time, until presumably most of Marika's enemies were wiped out by Messmer and his armies. After this, much to the shock of all those within the Land of Shadow, Queen Marika elected to abandon all those who still resided there, cutting them off from the rest of the world and leaving them stranded with no hope of salvation, including her very own demigod son, Messmer. At the time, nobody could understand why Marika would do this, why she would abandon those who have fought and shed blood in her name. For many of those that still resided in the Land of Shadow, it can be argued that some chose to live in denial for a time, believing that one day Marika would return for them, whilst for others, as time passed, came to the realization that Marika would never return and that they would never know why. Despite this abandonment, many soldiers and even Messmer himself continued to carry out her orders to purge those who lacked grace. The reason for this being that the soldiers were still fiercely loyal to Messmer, and that Messmer was still fiercely loyal to Marika. Despite this, the one thing that Messmer did not seem to know was the real reason behind Marika's purge. The real reason for all the pain and suffering that he had inflicted upon thousands and thousands of people. For you see, the main victims of this tragic crusade were an ancient and religious race known as the Hornsent. Long ago, in a time before the demigods, a time before Marika's ascension to godhood, the Hornsent ruled over Marika and her people, but not in a fair or righteous way. Instead, they worshipped the Crucible and almost completely wiped out Marika and her people, continuously torturing them in a ritualistic manner and having them stuffed into jars by the ruling Hornsent. It is widely believed that the jars located within the Shadow Keep are being kept there and preserved, as those trapped inside are said to be Marika's very own people, and that it is Messmer's intention to find a cure for and preserve them in any way possible. Once again, the lengths that Messmer would go to, not only to serve his mother, but also to help those around him, stand as a symbol towards his true inclination to care for others. Whilst it would seem that the Hornsent did indeed lack grace, which in turn makes them an enemy to the fundamentals of the Golden Order, it would also seem that Marika had an ulterior motive, a motive that was cloaked in revenge and hate. Marika saw the opportunity to dispose of what she deemed to be two problems at once: vengeance on the Hornsent for what they did to her people, and the chance to dispose of her accursed son Messmer, as he was a threat not only to her, but to the Golden Order and the Erdtree itself. She opted to use and manipulate Messmer into carrying out her revenge, knowing full well that he had the power to decimate her enemies in a painful and savage manner, and that she could also prey on the trusting and considerate nature of Messmer, as she knew that he would do whatever she would ask of him without even giving it a second thought. The second problem that she wished to take care of was within Messmer himself, as the burning flame that resides within him and the dark corrupting serpent that would eat away at it had the power to burn the Erdtree to cinders, similar to that of the fire giants that were also decimated in the name of Marika, with one of the main reasons for this being that their flame was strong enough to burn the Erdtree, which of course Marika could not allow to happen no matter the cost. Alongside this, the abyssal serpent clearly terrified Marika, as she was most likely plagued with the thoughts that one day it may escape its seal and cause unknown havoc to her and the Golden Order. Because of this, she abandoned Messmer in the Land of Shadow, never to return for him, finally completing her scheme for revenge and letting Messmer take the fall, as his reputation was now that of a bloodthirsty zealot who did nothing but inflict pain and misery on others. Finally, due to Messmer's cursed nature, he too lacked grace, and whilst his curse was sealed away, Marika knew that she could not have him anywhere near to her, as his very existence went against the Golden Order. Perhaps she was fearful that those who followed and worshipped her would one day find out about Messmer, and so she had to seal him away and have him erased from history in the process. Messmer was the shame of Marika. She was the embodiment of grace and purity, and she could not allow anyone to know that her offspring was the complete opposite, someone who was a cursed being lacking in grace. As time progressed, more and more people began to realize that they had been abandoned by Marika. However, almost all who followed Messmer on his crusade continued to stand by him. However, for others, they would instead rebel and turn against him upon discovering his dark and treacherous secret. At some point in time, Black Knight Commander Andreas, a devout friend and follower of Messmer, and his son, Black Knight Captain Hugh, discovered Messmer's serpentine nature and curse. Upon this blasphemous discovery, the two knights would rebel against their liege lord, a rebellion which would end with both Andreas and Hugh being rewarded with imprisonment in an underground tomb. If Messmer truly was the torturous and brutal villain that he is made out to be, it could be implied that he would have cruelly punished those who rebelled against him. But instead, for Messmer, despite the betrayal of his soldiers, he only imprisoned them and simply mourned the loss of his two close friends, people that he once viewed as brothers in arms. Despite his terrible deeds, Messmer was no doubt a man who felt deeply for others, a man of care and consideration with the ability to feel loss and sadness within his heart. This in turn begs the question, or at least the thought of Messmer purging all those people, and if he felt sadness for them or remorse for his actions at any point in time. Many years would come to pass by the Land of Shadow, cut off from the rest of the world and all those within it being removed from the chronicles of time. That was until one day, the player Tarnished would make his appearance, where like many others who ventured into the Land of Shadow, we too arrived following in the footsteps of kindly Miquella. During this journey, the player encountered many of Messmer's friends and foes, witnessing the destruction that was left behind in his wake and painting a terrible picture for the Tarnished in the process. Eventually, the player arrives at the infamous Shadow Keep, a tall and dark castle that overlooks the land and reaches high into the clouds. For the Tarnished, the perception that we receive is that of a terrible evil villain, a villain who sits atop his mighty and dark castle in the darkest room awaiting anyone who dares make it that far. And yet, behind the facade of evil and cruelty, there sits a complex and emotional man, someone who feels compassion and kindness that has been used and manipulated into believing that they are fighting for a just and fair cause. Upon entering the arena, the Tarnished is greeted by Messmer, where he seems somewhat shocked to see a graceless Tarnished arriving at his doorstep, and proceeds to question how Marika could allow something like this to happen. Upon proclaiming that he will not allow a lord devoid of light to take the throne, he proceeds to attack the Tarnished with what feels to be a reluctant but loyal nature. His desire to carry out Marika's orders and purge those without grace is still at the forefront of his mind. Even though Messmer himself lacked grace, he still refused to acknowledge that he too, like all others, had been abandoned. It could also be implied he most likely doesn't know what has happened within the lands between, including the Shattering or any of the many wars that have since followed. The confusion to see a Tarnished walk in the room, and yet his lack of questions towards the player's purpose or how this could have happened, once again show just how blind and devoted he was to Marika. During their battle, Messmer is forced to release the Abyssal Serpent from its seal and rely on its power in a desperate attempt to defeat the Tarnished, where in doing so, he turns to Marika and asks for forgiveness.
No, Mother. Forgive me.
It would seem that maybe Messmer has long since suspected that he was Marika's shame, and that by releasing the serpent, she would most likely resent him for it. The player ultimately defeats Messmer and the serpent within, putting a stop to his madness, and upon his dying breath, Messmer calls out to curse Marika, and instead refers to her as Marika instead of Mother, meaning that only in his final moments did he come to the sad realization that she was never going to return for him, despite all that he had done for her.
Mother. Marika. A curse upon thee.
Perhaps without Marika's corrupting influence, in another life, maybe there is a world where the Tarnished and Messmer could have befriended one another, in the same way that he befriended all those before him, similar to how Commander Gaius grew close to Messmer as he too lacked grace, much like the Tarnished. Messmer possessed the ability to inspire people from every background and culture, and it would seem that all his terrible deeds, at least the ones we are aware of, were committed under the name of Queen Marika the Eternal. Messmer only wanted to please and serve Marika. He was a kind and trusting soul at heart who was dealt a cursed hand from birth. He simply did what was asked of him without thought or hesitation, even if it went against what he himself would have elected to do. His Fire Knights and R'hllana were so loyal to him that even when they would learn of his serpentine curse, they continued to stay by his side, serving as the physical embodiment of just how great or beloved Messmer was. He was no doubt someone who inspired loyalty, devotion, and friendship in all those around him. He was a good and caring soul, and yet he died alone and full of resentment for the woman that he had given his entire existence to. Atop the Shadow Keep, he would spend a countless amount of time locked away in a dark room, clinging to Marika's embrace with the full belief that she would one day return for him. Behind Messmer's chair in the dark chamber, there resides one of the few statues of Queen Marika that is still fully intact, and it can be seen that the statue is holding a child, serving as a symbol of hope for Messmer and his true desires and wants that he would have longed for deep down. Despite this, he was a man who was living in a delusional state that he was only released from upon death, putting a very sad and pitiful end to his genocidal crusade. Messmer, like many others, was another great and powerful being that was caught up in one of Marika's schemes and plots and was ultimately forsaken by her. It would seem that almost all that is wrong within the present and past day of Elden Ring can be traced to Marika in some way, shape, or form. He had spent a lifetime hunting down and persecuting those that were deemed impure, even though he himself was more impure to the Golden Order than any of them, and as a result of this, he was not the son of Queen Marika the Eternal. He was instead just another tool to be used and manipulated by her, all for her own grand schemes of selfish desire and ambition. Whilst this itself does not excuse the horrific and violent acts that Messmer himself carried out, it does, however, add a deeper layer to his story and development, one that can teach a cruel lesson on the themes of betrayal, corruption, manipulation, and the condemning effects of both isolation and abandonment by those who you thought cared for you. I'm sure if Messmer could do it all again, knowing what he knows now, knowing what he felt with his dying breath, perhaps he would have sided with those who are lacking in grace, and instead used his flame to burn the Erd Tree to the ground in a vision of fire. What do you think Messmer would have done differently if he could do it all over again?